We now have, coming back from your break, we have our first of two thought vignettes, as we call them. The Professor Cesar McDowell is the professor of the practice of community development at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he will be leading a session entitled Democracy and Inclusion in the Intelligent Cities. Please welcome Cesar McDowell.
So I'm kind of soft-spoken, so I hope you can hear me out there. Can you? Good, okay. Well, as Scott said, I'm from MIT, and this is a conference on intelligent cities, so it's very appropriate that I start actually somewhere. Well, can I go back one? Thank you. That I start actually with the desert, the Kalahari Desert, and the coon of the Kalahari Desert. I want to start here because I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine who spent, a good 8 years of his life living among the coon of the Kalahari Desert. He was a cultural anthropologist. And while he was there, he spent a lot of time recording people. He was trying to understand how that culture worked. And he carried around this old Nagra tape recorder with him for 6 years. And every time he would go, he'd record people. He had this particular person named Tommaso that he recorded a lot. And one day, Tommaso stopped him and said, "How does that thing work?" And Dick said to him, "Well, you actually speak in that little microphone thing, and it records your voice, so you can play it back later." And Tommaso said, "Well, I know that, but how does it work?" So then Dick tried to show him a little bit more about, well, you see, it comes around, there are these heads, and it has some kind of magnetic thing on it, and, and anyway, it captures your voice. And Tommaso said, "Well, where did you get it?" And he said, "Well, I went to the store and I bought it." And Tommaso says, "Well, did the person who actually sold it to you know how it worked? Did they tell you how it works?" And Dick says, "No, they just sold it to me." And Tommaso said, in our culture, we would never give someone so powerful a tool without them understanding how it works. And I think this is a really appropriate place for us to think about all that we're doing and all we're making happen with these ideas of the intelligent city, and understand, how do we really understand? What is the thing that we need to know in order to make sure this is actually leading us to a better outcome? So we have this idea of the intelligent city coming about, and yet there are a couple of things we know that are really true. No matter where it goes, how it looks, there are two things we know are going to be true. Well, that was weird. I'm not getting a change here. There it goes. Okay. So one thing we know is that the place, more and more and more people throughout the world are going to be living in cities. And we know cities are going to be very, very large. The other thing that we know in the world right now is that wealth is not distributed equally. Okay? We have 10% of the people who own 85% of the global wealth. So that tells us something about what life in the city is going to be like. So for me, the question is, what is it that we know, what is the value that we have, that we operate out of right now, that we have to pay attention to as we're looking at this new city? And it actually comes from a great philosopher named Billie Holiday. She explains it all. It's that them that got shall get, them that don't shall lose. And she goes on a little bit further to say, and rich relations may give you a crust of bread and such. You have as a right, you can help yourself, but just don't take too much. Now that's the value, I say, that has led us to a lot of what we have going on in the world today. And I think if we're going to be able to do anything about it, as we think about how we actually design an equitable, intelligent city, then there are two things we're going to have to do. It's going to understand what are some of the patterns that have gotten us here to that place of all that inequality, and then what are the things that we need to disrupt to actually make it different. So I want to talk about 4 particular patterns: ownership, design, intelligence, and framing. And I'll go through them pretty quick. So ownership, I heard a lot today about privacy. Everyone talks about, privacy is really important to people, and I think privacy is important. I think it's a side conversation. The real issue we have in our country is around ownership. I mean, think about this, right? Our model right now says the way it works is if you own the pipeline or if you aggregate the data, you own it. You get to do things with it, right? I mean, look at Facebook, for example. Fascinating country, billions of dollars worth of value, but who's actually supplying all the information that the value is coming from? It's not the company. It's the people that's using it. So I would actually suggest that we need to look at something else on ownership. And I call this kind of building on the work that Larry Lessig did on the Creative Commons, that we start thinking about a personal digital commons in the intelligent city. So what will that mean? Well, the idea of the personal digital commons is, I'd say it would have like 4 licenses around data, and it would accrue to an individual automatically. Anytime any data is collected about you, you have license around that data. It's yours, and you can give license to other people to use it. And I have 4 licenses. One is free use. You can say, okay, every data that I generate in the world, anyone's free to use. The other option could be limited use. You say, okay, any data that comes out from me that I generate through my moving through the city, through my being in the city, is of limited use. And what I mean by limited is that if somebody else wants to use it, they have to negotiate with me every time, or maybe I give some general agreements of how and when it can be used. But the other option, and I think this is the most important one, is that there's a collective common use. That what I do is I take my data and I join with people that I'm in relationship with, my community, my neighborhood, my district, and say, you know, we are going to basically aggregate our data and the value of our data. And so therefore, if you want to use it for something, we're the ones who have to benefit from it. We benefited from not only exchange of information, but from monetary benefit. And the third one is you have the right to say, I don't care, I live in the city, but you can't use any of the data that I generate. Now, what would it mean actually in a place if you actually have this kind of collective use? Imagine what Facebook would look like today if it had to operate under this license structure of ownership of the data. It'd be very different. That $5 billion it's worth would be distributed a lot more to a lot more people in a lot of different ways. And that actually would start to shape and reshift that kind of wine glass model we have of wealth. That's one example. I'm going to skip over this, and I'll tell you about it later. Design is another session we're going to talk about. You know, design is not a neutral thing. Design is something that is intentional. It comes with a lot of set values in it. And that if we want to do something, you know, to really include more people in it, then we have to be purposeful about it. It's not enough to just say, you know, we're designing something and we hope other people will be able to benefit from it. Our design principles now are mostly like the whole thing that Billie Holiday said is this downstream. For people who are at the margins, we design things, you know, in a way that we think that they'll get it eventually in the end. There are a lot of people on the left who say, you know, believe this quote by Audre Lorde that says, you know, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But I actually think these tools of technology, the tools that we're using to build the intelligent city, actually can reshape things for everyone if we're mindful about it. And part of that mindfulness is what I call designing for the margins. And what do I mean by designing for the margins? So I always like to use this analogy. You know, if you think of society as a big ground here, when people are out and you have a tent, if you stake your tent in the middle, that's mostly what we do all the time, right? We design for the thing that there's the most of. You know, we say, well, let's design this because we know who's using cell phones right now. Let's design this for this particular purpose. You know, that's where we kind of stake our tent of design. And the thing about it is, it's not stable. It doesn't take into account all the other people around. But if you stake your tent at the margins, designing for whatever's at the extremes, the funny thing is you'll cover the rest. We're afraid of that concept. We don't believe it, but it's true. Right? So I argue for this idea that we actually need to be designing in a different way. So 2 quick examples of that. A few years ago, a student of mine by the name of Tad Hirsch and a person from the Asian American Community Development Corporation, Jeremy Liu, got together to try to look at a design issue within the Asian community in Boston. And one of the issues they were dealing with is, hey, You know, we have a lot of people who are coming into the community, they speak lots of languages, they have to have access to lots of services, and people go in, they're intimidated, and they can't even sometimes talk to the police, to the healthcare provider, to the school, because of language barriers. So the design they came up with this thing called Speakeasy. And Speakeasy is a system, it's an open source system that allows people who speak two languages, English and another language, to actually register themselves in the system. So I say I speak Cantonese and English, I have a cell phone, and I'm ready to do translations on Sundays between 1 and 2. Okay? Other people can do it for other times. Then, when someone goes in the hospital and they need a Cantonese speaker, there's one number that they call. The system automatically dials the person who's in queue, who speaks that language at that time, and they have the translation available. Someone to do that translation for them. But this is a system that's designed not with someone standing outside of a problem and thinking about, wouldn't it be nice if, but really being on the ground in a problem and then building and designing up from that. We've heard some more about that earlier today. Another example of this is, of course, the Voice Mobile system, which works with day laborers in Los Angeles, which is the same kind of system that was built from the ground up to help day laborers actually figure out how to communicate about the conditions under which they are working, something that is hidden from society, hidden from each other, so that they can actually organize and do something different about it. So intelligence. So we have this kind of notion, we talk about the intelligent city, but I always wonder kind of what kinds of intelligence are we talking about? So, you know, Howard Gardner has these notions about, you know, human intelligence, and there are multiple forms. And I kind of looked at his multiple forms and said, you know, when we think about the intelligent cities, we're really talking about kind of three of Gardner's notions of intelligence, kind of spatial, logical intelligence, language intelligence. And we leave out these others, you know, the kinesthetic intelligence, musical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalist. I don't know if Gardner has it right. There may be 30 different intelligences in the world, you know. I know there are more than 3. And the question for the intelligent city, as we think about it, is how are we going to incorporate and engage with all those different ways of knowing and making meaning out of the world? And this suggests for me that one of the primary issues for the intelligent city is the issue of creating the spaces and the opportunity for the negotiation of meaning. And I'll give you an example why this becomes important. I call it, actually, in the context of this, I say the disruption around here is we have to think about kind of inclusive knowledge. Not one form of knowledge or 2 forms, but how we actually have knowledge that's inclusive of all the different ways that people know and think. So there's this organization called Frameworks. The Full Frame Initiative. And I put this up here for example of kind of understanding different ways of knowing. So people who work in the mental health profession or substance abuse profession or any of the social service areas in this country kind of know that we have moved very quickly to a data-driven systems of understanding if systems are working, right? So you take someone who's in drug rehab, you have them in the drug rehab program, and the program that's running has to answer the question, did you keep that person drug-free for 45 days or 60 days or whatever it was? And if you did, you were successful. If you didn't, you weren't. But we know something about people, right? One of the things we know about people is that there are things that they need, right? Things that healthy people, families, and communities need. They need, they need increased social isolation. They need to know that they can have safety. They need to know that they can have stability. They need to know they can have mastery of some self-efficiency. And they need to have access to mainstream resources. When a person is in a system like that, a rehab system, what happens if they drop off out of 3 days and they come back 2 weeks later? They drop out again and they come back 2 weeks later again. Are they a failure? Or are they actually, in some sense, trying to do something about their isolation? They have found a place to connect to, and that place of connection is important, and it's part of their way of recovery. We, I think, right now have to be very careful about what the things are as we're thinking about measuring and analyzing and what the data is we're going to use in this intelligent city, or what we're actually measuring, what we're paying attention to. And some ways of knowing, some of the things that we need to pay attention to in the world, we don't have really good ways of capturing. And if we don't, and we go forward by just saying, well, the things that we do know how to capture really well, we'll lead with those. We'll continue to be in a situation where then the gat she'll get. Because the things that we already know how to do well have gotten us in the position that we're in now. They're not sufficient to get us out of it. And so we will just create intelligent cities that actually have intelligent slums and intelligent poverty and all the other problems that we have. So, framing. The last issue I want to talk about is framing. You know, we have this thing of, in policy and thinking about politics is about how an issue gets framed, says a lot about what the resolution is, you know, how we actually solve the problem. And, you know, we have lots of organizations and approaches to framing. You have things like deliberative democracy or appreciative inquiry, or you organizations like America Speaks or the National Issue Forums or town hall meetings, be they in person or electronic, doesn't really matter. But all of these things have one major problem. And that's the problem of scale, right? You have a city, 10 million people, 20 million people, a community of 10,000 people, 20,000 people. None of these systems work for that. What they leave you with is a representative set of folks, all right, who are speaking for others. And part of the reason why that is so, and part of the reason we get ourselves in this situation is because democracy in our country is no one's business, right? What we do with democracy in this country is we want to evoke it when we want to get something done. I'll give you an example of that. How many times have you ever been to a forum where there hasn't already been an agenda? Right? Come to the forum on this, come to the forum on that, come to the... Who set the agenda? Why is that the agenda? Right? So in some sense, if we are actually going to disrupt and have more people involved, then we have to figure out a way as how do we start from the ground up and let folks at the ground, no matter who they are, right, help to start set the agendas that we're actually, and frame the issues we're going to talk about. Sorry, my Twitter's bouncing up and down over here. So I talk about this idea of collective framing. And one of the approach in an organization we're using is the idea of questions, because we think questions are the most powerful way to get people to talk about issues and to talk about what's going on in their life. The belief that everyone in the world is driven by a set of questions. There are things that they are thinking about and questions that they have in their life, right? And so with our organization, we have this notion that, you know, everything in the world, every time something has changed, it's because someone asked the question, why it's so? And not just why is that so, but this is my experience in the world, and why is my experience this way, and that is so. It doesn't matter what it is. You can look at the Arab, you can look at the Arab Spring, you can look at anything that's going on. It is these questions that drive people to make change. So in our organization, we have this organization that I'm working around called Engage the Power, and part of our issue is about how do you use questions as a way to get people to frame issues in the city. And I'll tell you a little bit about just one example in a neighborhood we're working in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's a neighborhood about 10,000 people. And you know, we have this thing we're calling a question campaign. The goal is to get as many people in this city, in this neighborhood as possible to raise the questions they think are important from their own lived experience. Not to answer them, but to raise them. And we have everything, right? We have Twitter feeds, we have cell phone feeds, we have voicemail you can call in, you can text stuff in. We have all the technology to do it. But you know what we also know is that people live different kinds of lives. So we've also worked with the doctors and the schools and the churches and every other meeting, and any time people are gathered, for whatever they're gathered for, the people who are gathering them, ask them, do you have a question? Write it out on a card. If you can't write it out, you know, I'll call the number on my cell phone, you can speak it out. Gathering wherever people are is a challenge, right? And you can use the technology to help aggregate and bring together data that's coming from different sources and questions from different sources, but you can't use it to drive who gets to participate, right? That's the kind of difference. Now, an interesting thing about our work when we do this is oftentimes people, particularly people who are at the margins of society, don't think of themselves as having questions. They don't think of themselves as actually sometimes, I have something to offer. So the other side of what we do is we take people's questions and we mirror them with really powerful images, and then we put them up all over the community. And you start to have ads like this now up in this community. And people start to see, oh, that's us answering a question about our place, right? We're doing a project in Japan also where young people are doing it around the earthquake. They're using this campaign to say, well, we have a different set of questions, not about what's going on now, but who are we as a country and what are we doing? And so they're now trying to use this process as a way of getting questions out. We've done some global things with organizations where people are starting to understand, well, what's the nature of violence and why does it work for us? So the idea here is not so much these particular ads, but really the idea is that if you're going to work with the public to reframe things, you have to do a couple of things. You have to meet people where they are, and you have to reflect back to them their own intelligence. And you have to do it in a powerful way for them. So in closing, Franz Fanon, the great psychologist, had this notion that a community will evolve only when people control their own communications. The intelligent city is a city of live communications. People have to be able to control that for themselves in order for it to make a difference, for us not to have a society of where some get and some don't. If we want a better society, we need to open up that control. And I think these 4 disruptions can help us. Personal digital commons, designing for the margins, working at inclusive knowledge, and making sure we're doing collective framing. Thank you. Now I'm supposed to ask if there are any questions or not. Yeah, you have to use the mic if you don't mind. Excuse
me. Yeah, I'm Ethan Goffman from Sustainability, Science, Practice, and Policy. In the early days of the web, everyone was talking about what a great tool of democracy it was going to be, and everyone would have a voice. And you just mentioned the proprietary nature, and there was also a big move toward open source software. Mm-hmm. But Facebook is one example of where a company owns the information, but I'm even thinking of the Huffington Post, where there were all these bloggers working for free, and then Arianna Huffington sold it and made all this money for herself. So I'm wondering why hasn't it evolved in a more democratic direction, and maybe how that can be changed in the future, mm-hmm. or if it can be changed?
Well, I think there are 2 questions there. One is about the kind of the democratization. Does the internet and web in itself, can it lead to democratization? This other one is about value of information and knowledge. We don't have, I think we just don't have a system that says an individual themselves has a right to own everything that they generate. And we kind of move forward from that. We have it around some things, like if, there are, copyright laws around certain ideas and how you have to present ideas and for it to happen. But just by living and generating things, we don't have that. It's not a default. And I think if we start looking at information and data as a commodity, right, that it generates wealth, and so therefore people have to have some control of that. They're going to participate in it. That's how we start to change it. We have economies that have grown up first out of extractive natures, that the idea is that for some people to find out what the value of things, to extract those things, and then repackage them in some way, and then market them. Well, we haven't really changed that. The extraction now is around your knowledge, your information, and someone repackaging it. And I think the only way you can stop that is you have to have people deal with the person who's actually generated the knowledge to begin with. So, okay.
I just wanted to say this is just a small matter of the public taking online surveys, and I realized years ago that the framer of the questions, whatever they are, have already so heavily influenced the outcome that it's almost not worth doing unless there is a text space at the bottom that allows you to put a comment in of your own. I just...
No, I kind of agree with that because we have, I mean, you're right, a lot of surveys, a lot of polling and stuff, they've kind of framed things out for people and they're making the choices of what you can respond to. I actually don't know if you can tinker with that system and really make any any significant difference. I actually think it's a system that just doesn't work. And if we try to operate within that, we're not going to get very far.
Well, what happens is you don't get any nuance, and I think one of the few statements, for example, that here's what happens when you have lack of nuance. The other day when Newt Gingrich said something about, I don't think social engineering from the right is any better than it is from the left, and he got absolutely crucified for saying that. And I'm not one of his followers. However, I thought that was one of the few sensible things I'd ever heard the man say.
Exactly. Thank you. Thanks. Anyone else? Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Matt Quadnetz from Seattle. I'm kind of curious, in the earlier panel, we raised this idea that this is a resurgence of technology again. We've tried to use technology in the past for planning and failed. So as with many things, I really appreciate the point that you're making about if we're just pursuing the things we can quantify, then we might be repeating the same pattern. What are some of the ways you think that we can create these spaces for the notion of meaning and the inclusion of meaning in our societies when we're not exactly sure what we're targeting? How can we find those things, and how can we argue for them in a planning context that favors data over these intangibles?
This is a really, it's a really good question because in some sense, all the forces are aligned against this right now in very interesting ways. It's one of my big peeves with foundations right now. They really have gone to this kind of data-driven system, even when they're trying to work with people who are the most marginalized in society, because there's a certain level of result they want, and then you end up finding you're not understanding the nuance. So I believe that the only way you can do that, one way to do that, I shouldn't say the only way you can do that, is you got to have some patience. And you've got to kind of open up, and it's got to be messy, right? You got to open it up to the people that you're really interested in, got to slow down, and you got to know you're going to have a lot of failure, not be unwilling to experiment, and then reconnect again. When I say that democracy is no one's business, this is what I mean as part of the problem, is that every time we gather a set of people together, it's a one-off. We don't have embedded systems that are about the public's having a space to have its voice in an ongoing basis, right? So therefore, if I don't show up at this housing meeting, because, somebody in the planning department and a developer says, well, we got to have this because we got to have a public hearing on it, that's not my voice around, being in a democratic, inclusive society. There should be ongoing, regular processes that are open, that have no, in some sense, set agenda, often, that are about creating that space for people. So people don't have it as a habit. And if they don't have it as a habit, then they can't find the ways to help solve that. Yes, sorry.
Hi, Anita Hairston. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. Hi. Actually, continuing on that thread, you had a wonderful image up there that I think the question was about what do you do when so many government initiatives or city initiatives have already failed? And I was wondering if you could say more about this process of collective framing and how it can work in a situation where people know there's a set agenda with developers and a set of folks who are decision makers thinking about things. How do you have those open-ended questions in the context of what is actually a set agenda, especially when people in the neighborhood do know that that's out there?
Just let me give you a real quick example, expand a little bit on the example I gave in Springfield. So this neighborhood in Springfield is about 10,000 people. It's predominantly Puerto Rican. It's the two poorest census tracts in Massachusetts in this neighborhood. And they've started this kind of question campaign, right? So their goal is to get 20% at least of their population involved. And they're probably up to 25% now of people donating questions. But here's the interesting thing. They're not about answering the questions. They're getting people who have similar questions together. And then the question for them is, what in your experience has led you to this question? Because they want to understand what is the lived experience of people that causes this question to be happening. And then they're facilitating these conversations with them. Then they invite in institutions that are supposed to be providing the service to that, to hear what the experiences people are having with this question, and then to co-design some methods of addressing some of those experiences as they go out for the next year. So they're doing this as an agenda-setting framework for the whole community. And they've gotten a number of service institutions to buy in and say, we will set some of our goals for the next year in relationship to what comes out of this process. So that's kind of one way. And I think that's my time because somebody's saying go like this. So that's it. Thank you, everyone.